Three strangers in matching jackets stepped out of a white SUV, flashed photocopied badges, and ordered Garrett Holloway to unlock his own gate. He refused. Within minutes, the Homeowners Association president was screaming threats down the phone: $1,500 a day, a lien on his land, the sheriff hauling him away in cuffs. There was just one problem. Garrett did not live inside her boundary, and he had the paperwork buried in his own backyard to prove it. What the sheriff pulled from the county archives that day did not just save Garrett's land. It exposed a woman who had been quietly rewriting property lines for years, and nobody saw it coming. Garrett was 43 years old, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades learning every inch of the 620 acres that made up Holloway Ridge, the ranch he inherited from his late uncle. He was not a man who sought conflict. He fixed his own fences, ran his own cattle, and kept mostly to himself, which was exactly why the sight of 3 unfamiliar vehicles idling outside his southern gate on that October morning struck him as strange before anyone even stepped out. The lead man introduced himself as the head of community compliance for an organization called Silver Pines, a name Garrett had heard only in passing from neighbors 2 miles down the county road. He said the ranch had been formally absorbed into the association 3 years earlier, and that failure to allow entry for inspection would result in escalating penalties starting that same afternoon. Garrett studied the papers the man held through the bars of the gate. They were photocopies, unsigned, unstamped, carrying only a logo and a few paragraphs of vague language about community standards. He asked calmly what authority gave them the right to inspect private land they had never set foot on before. The man shifted uncomfortably and repeated himself, insisting that Holloway Ridge fell within the association's boundary and that continued refusal would be treated as active resistance. Garrett did not raise his voice. He simply told them the community boundary they were referring to ended nearly a mile from where they were standing, and that he had no intention of opening anything until someone showed him real documentation from the county itself. Within the hour, Vanessa Whitmore called him directly. She was the president of Silver Pines, 49 years old, polished in speech and unwavering in tone, the kind of woman who could turn a threat into something that sounded almost like concern for the neighborhood. She told Garrett that non-compliance would trigger a fine of $1,500 per day, that the association reserved the right to place a lien on his property, and that continued refusal could result in the revocation of his access to the shared road. Garrett answered that there was no shared road, only the private drive his family had used for 3 generations, and that her association's boundary line ended at a creek nearly a mile from his front porch. Vanessa's tone sharpened, and she warned him that law enforcement would be involved if he did not cooperate before the situation grew, in her words, unnecessarily serious. Garrett recorded the entire exchange on his phone without announcing that he was doing so, a habit ingrained in him from years of dealing with contractors and easement disputes on the ranch. When one of the 3 men outside tried to reach through the bars of the gate to release the latch himself, Garrett stepped forward and told him plainly that crossing onto private property without permission would be treated as trespassing. Nothing more, and nothing less. The group backed away, muttering among themselves. But before they left, they taped a printed notice to the gatepost, declaring a formal violation and outlining the penalties Vanessa had already described over the phone. Garrett watched their SUV pull away slowly, but it did not leave entirely. It stopped a few hundred yards down the road, and through the tinted glass he could see Vanessa herself sitting quietly watching the ranch, as though she were studying something far more valuable than a fence line. Garrett had grown up hearing his uncle talk about the value of a clean deed and a fence line nobody could argue with, and standing at that gate he found himself grateful for every hour the old man had spent teaching him to read a survey properly. The ranch had survived droughts, market crashes, and 2 failed attempts by a mining company decades earlier to claim mineral rights beneath the northern pasture, and none of those threats had ever come dressed in a blazer carrying a plash clipboard. Still, something about the calm, rehearsed way the 3 visitors had spoken told Garrett this was not their first attempt at this particular routine, and he suspected it would not be their last. After they finally drove off, Garrett peeled the notice from the post and turned it over. On the back was a small hand-drawn map, and on that map the boundary of Silver Pines had been extended in a straight, deliberate line directly through the middle of his property, cutting across pastures that had belonged to his family, since long before the association even existed. He carried the notice into his office and set it beside the framed county survey his uncle had kept on the wall for as long as Garrett could remember, and the mismatch between the 2 was impossible to ignore. Whatever this was, it was not a simple misunderstanding about a fence, and Garrett intended to find out exactly what Vanessa Whitmore was really after before she got the chance to try again. The following morning, Garrett spread every land record he owned across his kitchen table, comparing the hand-drawn map from the association against the original county survey his family had kept since the property was first deeded more than 70 years earlier. According to every legitimate document he possessed, Silver Pines sat entirely on the eastern side of Dry Elk Creek, while Holloway Ridge occupied the western side, a piece of land that had never once been folded into any homeowners association in its entire history. He found the deed of transfer from his uncle, the original surveyor's stamp from the county office, a letter confirming the ranch, fell outside any planned community zoning and tax bills that had always come directly from the county, rather than through any association channel. While Garrett worked through his paperwork, Vanessa convened an emergency meeting of the Silver Pines board, describing Garrett to the room as a hostile landowner attempting to benefit from community roads and scenery without paying a cent toward its upkeep. She painted the ranch as a blighted eyesore, dragging down property values, framed it as an obstacle standing in the way of the association's expansion plans, and pushed for 3 immediate measures: an emergency fine schedule, a private security contract to monitor the gate, and a filing with the county to have the boundary formally redrawn in the association's favor. Marlene Foster, the 61-year-old treasurer who had served the board loyally for years, asked the obvious question that no one else seemed willing to raise, wondering aloud why the association had never once collected dues from that property in all the years it supposedly belonged to them. Vanessa brushed the question aside as an administrative oversight, and when Marlene pressed further, asking why there was no signed agreement on file showing the landowner had ever consented to join the association, Vanessa pivoted smoothly into a speech about protecting shared community interests. Garrett, unaware of the meeting taking place across the creek, reached out to Everett Sloan, a 52-year-old land attorney with a calm, deliberate manner and a reputation for letting opponents talk themselves into their own downfall. After reviewing everything Garrett had gathered, Everett confirmed what Garrett already suspected. The association had no legal authority to inspect the property. The fine was entirely unenforceable, and the act of sending people posing as compliance officers could carry real criminal weight if it turned out they had misrepresented their authority. Everett advised patience, rather than an immediate lawsuit, insisting they first needed to understand what Vanessa was truly trying to accomplish, since none of this behavior made sense over a fence or a pair of parked tractors. That question lingered until Garrett remembered an offer he had quietly declined months earlier from a development company interested in purchasing the southern strip of his land, the only stretch that provided access to a scenic overlook above the valley. He had turned the offer down without much thought at the time, but now staring at the doctored map with its boundaries shoved deep into his territory, he began to suspect that Vanessa cared nothing about hedges or equipment. What she wanted was the road running straight through his family's land. That suspicion was confirmed within days, when Everett discovered that Silver Pines had already begun quietly promoting a new development called Silver Pines Summit, a planned community of 38 luxury homes overlooking the same valley Garrett could see from his own back porch. The only road capable of reaching that overlook ran directly through Holloway Ridge, and suddenly every fine, every fabricated map, and every threatening phone call made perfect sense. Vanessa was not trying to enforce community standards at all. She was trying to manufacture a path onto land she did not own, using fear and bureaucracy as her shovel, and Garrett realized he was no longer dealing with an overzealous board president but with someone willing to falsify records to get what she wanted. Vanessa moved quickly once her plan was threatened, sending a mass message to every resident of Silver Pines that painted Garrett as a man blocking a road the community had supposedly used for years, threatening staff refusing safety, inspections, and standing in the way of a project meant to raise every single property value in the neighborhood. She never mentioned that the road in question sat entirely within Garrett's own deed, and within days a small crowd of residents gathered outside his gate carrying signs and demanding he open his land to inspection. Garrett refused to engage in shouting matches with strangers, who had been fed a story designed to make him the villain, choosing instead to let his cameras run continuously while quietly recording the license plate of every vehicle that showed up uninvited. Vanessa stood in front of the crowd and declared that Garrett was holding an entire community hostage behind a locked gate, a line clearly designed for maximum outrage rather than any factual accuracy. Many of the residents had been promised extraordinary returns from the Silver Pine Summit project, including a 30% rise in home values, a new clubhouse and restaurant, lower monthly dues, a dedicated road repair fund, and even a future profit share for the neighborhood. Promises so generous that Garrett suspected from the start they were built on nothing but air. Frustrated that the crowd had not forced his hand, Vanessa called the sheriff's office directly and reported that Garrett had threatened association staff and was blocking access to what she called a shared public roadway, a claim that brought Deputy Travis Bellamy out to the ranch within the hour. Vanessa met Travis at the gate with a thick folder of documents, including the falsified boundary map, an internal violation notice, a supposed shared road declaration, and photographs of Garrett standing behind his own locked fence, as if that alone proved wrongdoing. Garrett met the deputy with his original deed in hand, calmly asking him to verify everything against the county's actual land records before taking any action whatsoever. And Travis, though clearly influenced by Vanessa's confident presentation, chose caution over confrontation. He did not arrest Garrett, but he did instruct both parties to avoid contact until the boundary question could be properly resolved. A decision that visibly infuriated Vanessa, who told the gathered residents afterward that Garrett was simply delaying what she called the inevitable. That same night, Garrett discovered that the secondary lock on his northern gate had been cut, though no one had made it past the outer fence. Tire tracks led toward the exact strip of road the proposed development needed, and his cameras had captured a pickup truck belonging to the same private security company Vanessa had hired weeks earlier. Everett advised Garrett to send formal trespass notices to Vanessa, every board member, and the security company itself, while also forwarding the footage directly to Travis, who quickly realized that one of the men in association jackets was not any kind of licensed officer at all, but simply a private guard with no legal authority whatsoever. When Travis pulled the vehicle registration for the security company, he found something far more troubling than a case of overreach. The business address listed for the security firm matched Vanessa's own private office, a detail that instantly transformed a messy boundary dispute into something that looked far more deliberate and far more dangerous than anyone outside her inner circle had realized. Everett hired Lydia Grant, a 45-year-old land surveyor known throughout the county for her precision and her refusal to bend her findings for anyone, regardless of how much pressure they applied. Lydia pulled the county's original survey files, historical aerial photographs, modern satellite imagery, and the exact language of the 1952 deed, which described the boundary running from an old pine tree to a granite marker along Dry Elk Creek before following the water south toward the valley floor. Vanessa insisted no such marker had ever existed, a claim that sent Lydia searching for 2 full days along a stretch of creek bank that had clearly been altered by recent construction work and fresh gravel fill. Garrett recalled that the association had hired a crew the previous year to reinforce the creek bank following a heavy storm work that had taken place on the opposite side of the water, but may well have buried the very marker Lydia was searching for. After noticing a patch of soil with a different color and texture than the surrounding earth, Lydia and her crew dug down nearly a full meter and finally struck stone, revealing a weathered granite marker etched with the letter H for Holloway, an old survey file number, an arrow pointing toward the creek, and the year the boundary had first been recorded. The coordinates matched Garrett's deed precisely, but what troubled Lydia most was a fresh scratch across the surface of the stone and a broken metal chain link, nearby evidence that someone had tried and failed to pull the marker from its original position. Lydia had worked land disputes across 3 counties over her career, and she told Garrett privately that she had rarely seen a marker deliberately buried rather than simply lost to erosion or neglect, since the depth and the fresh fill surrounding it suggested intent rather than accident. She photographed every angle of the stone, logged the coordinates twice, using separate equipment to eliminate any possibility of error, and had Garrett sign a witness statement on the spot, so there could be no later argument about when or how the marker had been found. Garrett asked Lydia to keep her discovery quiet until her full report was complete, but 2 men working for the association were spotted photographing the site from across the creek within hours, and it did not take long for Vanessa to learn that Garrett had found something she desperately needed, buried and forgotten. She fired off a new notice, demanding Garrett halt what she called unauthorized digging on community land, prompting Everett to respond in writing and request that she produce any deed proving her association owned that stretch of creek bank. She could not produce one. Instead, she filed a document with the county titled a Voluntary Boundary Adjustment Agreement, bearing a signature that appeared to belong to Garrett's late uncle, a man who had passed away years earlier while under long-term medical care in another state entirely. Garrett recognized instantly that the signature was wrong since his uncle had always signed his full name, including his middle initial, while the document bore only a first and last name written in an unfamiliar hand. Everett ordered a formal handwriting analysis, and the preliminary results confirmed exactly what Garrett suspected from the first glance, showing that the signature had been lifted from an old canceled check and digitally pasted onto the per census association's fabricated agreement, a discovery that turned a boundary dispute into a documented case of forgery. Vanessa's next move was a bill totaling $45,000, itemized across 15 days of refused inspections, processing fees, association, legal costs, security expenses, access restoration charges, and penalties for what she called an unauthorized fence. She warned Garrett that failure to pay within 10 days would result in a lien being placed on his property, a threat Everett dismissed outright, explaining that an association could not legally place a lien on land that had never joined its community in the first place. Undeterred, Vanessa sent an even larger group to the gate, A few days later, 6 people this time, 2 security vehicles and a contractor carrying bolt cutters, all under the pretense of a survey needed before construction on Silver Pines. Summit could officially begin. Garrett had prepared for exactly this moment, with cameras mounted on the gate and the barn, an audio recorder, running printed copies of his deed, and a formal notice barring the association from entering his land under any circumstance. Vanessa arrived in person and demanded the gate be opened so her contractor could begin measuring for the new road. And when Garrett asked whether she was finally admitting the real purpose behind all of this had never been fence violations but access for her private development deal, her composure cracked for just a moment before she waved the contractor forward anyway. As the bolt cutters were raised toward the chain, Garrett called the sheriff's office, and within minutes both Deputy Travis and Sheriff Boone Mercer arrived at the scene, drawn by the sheer number of complaints already piling up around this one property. Vanessa demanded Boone arrest Garrett immediately for obstructing what she called a shared access route, but the 56-year-old sheriff, a man who had known the Holloway family for decades and had little patience for political pressure, asked her plainly whether she carried a court order. She did not. He asked whether she had any recorded deed granting a right-of-way through the property. She produced only the association's own hand-drawn map, which Boone dismissed immediately as an internal document rather than anything recognized by the county. Vanessa shifted tactics, insisting this was purely a civil matter outside police jurisdiction, but Boone reminded her that a contractor cutting a lock to enter someone else's land without a court order was no longer just a civil disagreement. The contractor set his tools down without another word, and Boone ordered every association representative off the property immediately, prompting Vanessa to turn to the gathered crowd and accuse the sheriff of favoring Garrett because of old family ties, a claim Boone did not bother to answer. Before leaving, he studied the hand-drawn map one final time and told her flatly that the boundary shown on it did not match anything he had ever seen in the county's official land records. A statement that hung over the crowd long after his patrol car had pulled away. The following morning, the county land records office filled with more people than it had likely seen in years, including Garrett, Everett, Vanessa, 2 board members, Marlene, Lydia, Boone, Travis, several adult residents of Silver Pines, and the clerk responsible for maintaining the official survey archive. Vanessa arrived with her own attorney and a thick binder, still insisting that Holloway Ridge had been legally absorbed into the association through a boundary adjustment agreement. But when the clerk searched the system for any record of an application, a signed consent form, an amended deed, a county acknowledgement, a tax reassignment notice, or a certified notarization, nothing appeared in the files at all. Boone asked the clerk to pull the original certified map, and once it was unfolded across the wide table for everyone in the room to see, the boundary of Silver Pines stopped precisely at the eastern bank of Dry Elk Creek, leaving all 120 acres of Garrett's ranch untouched on the western side. Lydia presented the coordinates from the granite marker she had uncovered, and they matched the certified survey exactly, leaving Vanessa's attorney to argue weakly that a shift in the creek's natural flow over the decades should have shifted the boundary along with it. Lydia rejected that argument outright, explaining that fixed markers determine legal boundaries regardless of minor natural changes in a waterway, and that no legal process had ever been filed to adjust the line, even if such a shift had occurred. Boone turned to Vanessa and asked her directly why the association's own map extended the boundary nearly a mile further west than anything on record, and when she claimed it represented projected lines following an anticipated merger. Everett calmly listed every action she had taken using that same unofficial map, from issuing fines to hiring security, from threatening a lien to authorizing a contractor to cut a lock, all built entirely on a boundary that existed only in her own imagination. Boone finally spoke the words that ended any ambiguity in the room, stating clearly that Holloway Ridge had never belonged to Silver Pines and that no legal evidence existed to suggest otherwise, a declaration that silenced the entire office and turned several residents' attention sharply toward Vanessa. Marlene asked in front of everyone whether the association had already accepted a deposit from the development company behind the proposed community, and Vanessa told her to be quiet rather than answer. Boone confirmed separately that the road running through the ranch belonged solely to Garrett, with no recorded public right-of-way and no association claim whatsoever. Garrett did not gloat or raise his voice. He simply asked Vanessa to withdraw the fines, cancel any lien filing, cease contact with his property entirely, stop advertising his road as shared community access, and issue a correction to every resident who had received her earlier accusations. She refused every request and stormed out, declaring the matter would be settled in court instead. But before she reached the parking lot, Marlene quietly pressed a small drive into Everett's hand and told him that the fabricated map was the smallest part of what Vanessa had actually done with the association's money. The files on the drive Marlene handed over revealed internal financial statements, a string of emails between Vanessa and a development firm called Ridgewell Development, assigned consulting contract invoices from the same security company, tied to Vanessa's office address blueprints for Silver Pine Summit, a list of suspicious wire transfers and meeting minutes that had never once been shared with the residents who were paying the bills. According to the agreement Vanessa had personally negotiated, the association was required to guarantee vehicle access through Garrett's land, and in exchange, Ridgewell would pay the association $2,400,000. Once the development received final approval with Vanessa, personally collecting a separate consulting fee of $320,000 on top of that. The contract also placed the entire legal cost of any access dispute squarely on the association itself, while allowing Vanessa to draw from the community's reserve fund to finance the earliest stages of construction before a single home had even been approved. Marlene admitted she had signed several of the transfer authorizations herself, believing at the time that the money was intended for legitimate road improvements. And it was only after tracing the destination accounts back to businesses connected to Vanessa that she began quietly preserving copies of everything for her own protection. Everett forwarded the entire drive to Boone, who passed it along to the county's fraud investigation unit and the local prosecutor's office, setting a formal criminal review into motion, even as the civil boundary dispute remained unresolved. Garrett still had to protect his property, since Vanessa showed no sign of backing down, despite mounting evidence against her. And at a chaotic association meeting soon after she accused Marlene of stealing and altering internal records to frame her unfairly, Marlene responded by reading aloud in front of the entire room one of Vanessa's own emails, in which she had written that if Garrett refused to open his gate voluntarily, the board would simply manufacture enough violations to force him into selling the property outright. The residents in attendance grew visibly furious, as they realized the rising dues they had paid over the past 2 years had never funded neighborhood improvements at all, but had instead been quietly funneled into a development scheme they had never actually approved through any legitimate vote. Another board member admitted under pressure that Vanessa had repeatedly asked members to sign blank meeting minute pages, ostensibly for convenience, though it now seemed clear those pages had been filled in, however she pleased. Afterward, residents demanded an emergency recall vote on the spot, but Vanessa declared the vote invalid and walked out of the meeting entirely. And that same night, Garrett's cameras alerted him to a small excavator approaching his southern gate under the authority of a work order bearing Vanessa's signature, instructing the crew to widen the access road before any court could issue a formal injunction against them. Garrett called Boone rather than confront the driver directly, and Travis arrived in time to stop the machine before it ever touched the fence line, discovering that the operator genuinely believed the association already held legal ownership over the road he had been sent to widen. Scrawled at the bottom of that same work order, almost as an afterthought, was a handwritten note in Vanessa's own writing, insisting the road absolutely had to be opened before Monday because once it existed physically on the ground, no one would ever be able to close it again. Vanessa and her attorney filed for an emergency court order demanding Garrett open his gate immediately, arguing that the road had supposedly served the community for years, that the association had invested money, maintaining it, that Garrett's refusal was causing significant economic harm, that dozens of homeowners depended on the access, and that the entire Silver Pine Summit development would collapse without it. Everett countered that the association had never legitimately used that road at all, since every recent appearance by association vehicles had occurred only in the past several weeks and had been immediately challenged by Garrett each time, meaning no claim of long-term use could possibly apply. Everett laid out the county's certified survey, Lydia's full report photographs of the granite marker footage of the attempted lock cutting the internal email, describing a plan to manufacture violations, the secret contract with Ridgewell Development, and the handwritten work order demanding the road be opened before any injunction could take effect. Vanessa claimed her email had been taken out of context, insisting that manufacturing enough violations simply meant conducting more thorough inspections, though she offered no real explanation when Everett asked why she had been applying association rules to a property that had never belonged to the association at all. Lydia testified next, walking the court through every coordinate and confirming there was no technical basis whatsoever for the boundary shown on the association's map. Boone testified that the county had no record of any legitimate merger, and Travis confirmed that the private security guards had worn uniforms closely resembling law enforcement gear, creating confusion for both Garrett and the surrounding residents about who actually held any real authority. The excavator operator testified honestly that he had been instructed to proceed with widening the road even if the property owner objected, a statement that visibly unsettled the judge presiding over the case. Everett closed his argument by reminding the court that a homeowners association, no matter how large its ambitions, could not manufacture jurisdiction over land simply by wanting it badly enough, and that every dollar spent chasing this road had been spent chasing something that never legally existed. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally glancing down at the certified county survey, as though checking it against everything being said. And when Vanessa's attorney attempted one final argument about implied community benefit, the judge cut him off, noting that implied benefit was not the same as a recorded legal right. The judge denied the association's request outright and issued a temporary order barring Vanessa and the entire association from entering Holloway Ridge, prohibiting further fines, blocking any lien filing, halting all advertising, claiming access rights over the road, requiring the preservation of every financial record tied to the association, and freezing construction on Silver Pine Summit until the matter could be fully resolved. Vanessa left the courthouse, still insisting to the residents gathered outside that she intended to appeal, but investigators soon discovered a separate transfer of $180,000 routed from the association's H&S and reserve fund into a limited liability company registered under the name of Vanessa's own cousin, a business that had never once provided any actual service to the community. Ridgewell Development quickly sent a formal termination letter stating they had relied entirely on Vanessa's false representations regarding legal access to the property, and they demanded the return of their deposit while threatening litigation of their own against the association. Residents throughout Silver Pines slowly began to realize they could be personally on the hook for a project that had never possessed any legal foundation to begin with. And when investigators arrived at the association's office to formally collect financial records, they found several boxes of documents already being loaded into the back of Vanessa's own vehicle. Despite mounting calls for her resignation, Vanessa called a special meeting of her own, hoping to use it to blame Garrett, publicly accuse Marlene of stealing internal data, push through an emergency dues increase to cover mounting legal costs, install a new attorney loyal, only to her, and block the recall vote residents had been demanding for weeks. More than 100 adult homeowners packed into the room that evening, and Vanessa took the stage, still carrying herself as though she remained firmly in control, painting Garrett once again as a wealthy landowner determined to sabotage the community's future for no reason beyond his own stubbornness. Garrett had not planned to attend, but Marlene insisted he needed to be there so residents could finally hear the truth directly rather than through Vanessa's carefully managed messaging, and he arrived alongside Everett and Lydia, carrying nothing more than the essential documents: the original deed, the certified county map, Lydia's survey report, the court's temporary order, a copy of the secret Ridgewell contract, and photographs from the night the excavator had been stopped at his gate. Garrett kept his remarks brief, telling the crowd he had never once asked Silver Pines for money or recognition, only that they stay off land they had never legally owned in the first place. Marlene then presented the full financial report, revealing that Vanessa had funneled more than $540,000 from the association's funds into a security company connected to her own name, legal fees tied to the failed development deal, a fabricated survey construction, deposits, a consulting firm that delivered no actual services, and a public relations effort aimed squarely at discrediting Garrett throughout the community. One resident asked directly whether Vanessa stood to personally collect $320,000 if the development had gone forward, and when she tried to describe it as nothing more than lawful future compensation, Everett reminded the room that she had never disclosed this conflict of interest to the board at any point during the negotiations. As anger swept through the crowd and demands for immediate refunds grew louder, Vanessa attempted to declare the meeting adjourned, but Boone entered the room at that exact moment, alongside Travis and two financial investigators, informing everyone present that they carried a warrant to search both the association office and Vanessa's personal vehicle. Rather than making a spectacle of arresting her on the spot, Boone simply asked her to surrender the office keys, her work computer, and her business phone, a request Vanessa initially refused by claiming everything belonged to the association's protected records. When the investigators produced a warrant bearing a judge's signature, she had no choice but to comply, and the surrendered phone would later prove to be one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case. Under the supervision of an independent attorney, residents proceeded with the long-delayed recall vote that same evening, and the results left no room for interpretation. Vanessa was removed from her position by an overwhelming margin. Every remaining financial authority she held was revoked immediately. Marlene was appointed as temporary manager to stabilize the association. The board voted unanimously to cancel the Silver Pine Summit project entirely. Every claim against Holloway Ridge was formally withdrawn, and residents demanded a complete independent audit of the past several years of spending. As the meeting broke apart, Vanessa attempted to slip out through a side exit, but Travis intercepted her after investigators discovered an envelope containing additional forged transfer documents hidden inside her vehicle. Boone informed her she was being detained for questioning related to real estate fraud, forged signatures, misuse of association funds, obstruction of an active investigation, conspiracy to trespass on private property, and filing false reports with law enforcement. Garrett stood near the back of the room, feeling no satisfaction in watching her downfall unfold in front of so many people, only a quiet relief that his gate would finally be protected by something stronger than his own patience. Before she was led away, Vanessa turned toward Garrett and told him he had destroyed an entire community. He answered simply that he had not destroyed anything. He had only refused to open his gate for her lies. 3 months later, the formal investigation concluded that Vanessa had built a calculated multi-step scheme to seize control of the road running through Holloway Ridge, beginning with an altered boundary map followed by a fabricated merger agreement, a series of manufactured violations designed to apply financial pressure security personnel dressed to resemble genuine law enforcement threats of an illegal lien, a development contract signed before any legal access existed, and finally, rushed attempt to physically construct the road before a court could intervene. Facing overwhelming evidence, Vanessa accepted a plea agreement covering multiple charges rather than risk a lengthy trial. And under its terms, she was ordered to repay every dollar taken unlawfully, compensate the association for its losses, cover the damages and legal costs Garrett had personally incurred permanently, surrender any right to hold a leadership position within a community organization, again, complete a strict period of court supervision, and forfeit any financial interest tied to the failed development deal. The security company lost its operating license within the county after investigators confirmed its staff had misrepresented their legal authority to residents and law enforcement alike, and Ridgewell Development formally withdrew from Silver Pines altogether, settling its financial disputes with the association separately rather than pursuing a public legal battle. Silver Pines came dangerously close to financial collapse but ultimately avoided the worst outcome by canceling the development entirely, selling off undeveloped land the association legitimately owned, recovering a portion of the missing funds from the businesses connected to Vanessa, cutting unnecessary administrative costs, negotiating directly with creditors, and forming an entirely new board built around transparency rather than personal ambition. Marlene chose not to remain in a permanent leadership role, staying only long enough to finish the financial audit and oversee a fair, open election for new leadership once the community had stabilized. Under the reforms adopted afterward, the association was required to publicly disclose any contract above a set dollar amount. Board members had to formally declare any conflict of interest before votes were taken. No expansion of the community's boundary could occur without a landowner's written and notarized consent. Every withdrawal from the reserve fund required resident approval through an open vote. No association, staff, or contractor could dress or present themselves as government law enforcement, and any boundary dispute required verification through county records before a single notice could legally be sent. Garrett never joined Silver Pines and never sought any position on its new board, choosing instead to work with Lydia to permanently mark his property line with clear county-recorded boundary posts along the length of the creek. Beside the new markers, he placed a small sign, reading simply that Holloway Ridge remained private property, its boundary formally recorded by the county, a quiet but permanent answer to a claim that had once nearly cost him his family's private land. Boone visited the ranch not long after the case closed, bringing with him an updated copy of the recorded survey and telling Garrett plainly that he had handled the entire ordeal exactly the way it needed to be handled, with patience instead of confrontation. Garrett admitted there had been moments when he wanted nothing more than to physically remove every stranger who showed up uninvited at his gate, but in the end it was the cameras, the documents, and his refusal to lose his composure that had protected him far better than any argument ever could have. In the months that followed, several residents of Silver Pines came to the ranch personally to apologize, admitting they had once believed Garrett was standing in the way of the community's future, only to later understand they had been used as leverage in a private scheme that had nothing to do with their genuine interests. Garrett never demanded loyalty or apology from anyone. He simply told them that no one should ever sign or vote on something they had not read carefully for themselves. By the following spring, he had repaired the southern gate completely, keeping the original private property sign in place, but adding a single new line beneath it, a reminder that ownership does not begin with someone else's permission, but with the truth itself, recorded, measured, and impossible to erase no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. On quiet evenings after the work was done, Garrett sometimes walked down to the creek and stood beside the granite marker Lydia had unearthed, running his fingers over the old carved letter that had outlasted every fence, every threat, and every fabricated map thrown against it. He thought about how close the whole scheme had come to succeeding, not through force, but through paperwork confidence and the simple assumption that no one would ever bother to dig deep enough to check. The ranch remained exactly where it had always been, unmoved by any of it, and Garrett understood better than most that the strongest boundary a person could ever hold was not a locked gate or a loud argument, but a record that told the truth. Long after everyone else had stopped listening,